Welcome to the Maintainable Software Podcast, where we explore the art of improving existing software with seasoned practitioners who have helped organizations overcome the problems often associated with technical debt and legacy code. I'm your host, Robbie Russell. On this episode, we have Tom Johnson, currently the co-founder and CEO of Multiplayer. Tom joins us from Brooklyn, New York, in the United States. Tom Johnson, we're so glad to have you join us on Maintainable. Welcome.
Glad to be here.
So as you reflect on your experience in the industry, what do you believe are a few common characteristics of, dare I say, well-maintained software?
That's a great question. I think there are some things that commonly go together with well-maintained software, some documentation, tests, but I think in addition to that, you've got to have, kind of a workflow and a team ethic to produce the software to make it maintainable over the long term. So it's not just the end artifacts, but, how you, having source control. It wasn't always the case that you had source control. Or CI/CD is a kind of like a newish thing. Okay, maybe if you've been in the industry longer than maybe 10 years, you remember the before times, so you didn't have all these great tools. But I would say well-maintained software has to have these components for team workflow, working well together, tracking your source code, understanding its history, that kind of stuff, in addition to good tests, good documentation. And I think one of the other trends that we see is software is more distributed than it ever has been. There's complexity in the number of components you have in your systems. So system level documentation and understanding of what that top-down view of your architecture is super important as well, because no longer do you develop software and it's just a desktop app. Most software is a distributed system. And as you have more and more components, you need to have this higher level view for it to be well maintained. And you have to be able to provide great system architecture documentation, API documentation, things like that, and as well as tests for posterity, for that future generation that might end up needing to change your code later on, and you're far gone and moved on to another project or another company. And I think that these are relatively newish concepts for well-maintained software.
There's a number of things you said there that I want to dig into, and we'll cover some. We'll come back to a couple of those things, but you think a little bit about, you brought up just even source control, and I was actually having a conversation coincidentally with my brother-in-law a few weeks ago. He's a software engineer, and he works primarily in more like the hardware side of things, on like BIOS things, and he was talking about how they're just starting to consider the idea of switching to using something like Git, and like they're still using Subversion, and like I'm like, oh, do you ever need local branches? And he's kind of like, why would I need that? And I remember thinking that was the conversation we were having like 18 years ago. But you're also thinking about so aside from that, and I'm like, I didn't even get into like the CI/CD pipeline part of that process there, but when you think about how software, you just brought up the idea around like desktop applications, and things would run locally on your computer. You didn't even need to have an internet connection to operate the application. It wasn't a requirement necessarily. And a lot of software can't sync. Looking at my Evernote right now and be like, well, it's kind of offline mode, but I also know that if I don't connect to the internet, I can't sync the stuff that I had on my phone earlier, back and forth. And so there's a lot more things to think about. Do you think it's harder for software engineers coming into the industry now to wrap their head around all this stuff because they didn't evolve, their careers weren't evolving as like the technology complexity was evolving?
I think new developers, from what I've seen, they're adopting all of this great tooling and best practices and source control and other stuff. And that's just their world. That's what their understanding is of how to develop software. I think for older folks, like, in my category, I've been developing 25 plus years, seen the evolution. I remember when I've been a part of projects where there was no source control at all, and you had a team of 10, 15 people, and it was impossible to merge changes and stuff like that. You had to do it manually. The before times, I call it, very, very difficult. There are some people I've found that would resist change, resist using these new tools. So I think it's harder for maybe some of the older developers who might be set in their ways and comfortable to say, hey, why would I need Git? Why would I need local branches? Whereas new people are like, this is just the way the world is. And I think it points to something else beyond sort of maintainable software, beyond like documentation, testing, the tooling, is debugging these days is really hard. To be able to run your software, your distributed system in an easy, straightforward way is a big part of whether it's maintainable or not. And I think that, the tooling, your IDE is not built to, debug distributed systems. That's actually one of the things we're looking to solve at Multiplayer. But I think part of writing software that's well maintained, especially in today's world where things are just distributed, you have lots of components, and a lot of times you're not changing everything. You're probably changing one or two things for the new feature. You're adding a microservice or changing an API or adding something here or there, bringing in a third-party dependency. You still have to have a lot of other stuff running. Not all of it can fit in your laptop. You're not going to run AWS there, right? And you have your production environment, your staging environment. What do you do for development? To be able to have well-maintained system, you have to answer this question like, okay, somebody in the future will need to run this, debug it, work on it, understand dependencies in order to change things without breaking stuff. And I think the tooling comes into play quite a bit in addition to, the documentation and tests, of course, which are sort of table stakes, I think.
While I was preparing for this conversation, I heard that you once had to cut off a CEO's access to the database to keep production stable. What happened there? Tell us more about this story.
Oh my goodness. Oh, yeah, so we all have horror stories in our careers. So this is one of mine. I worked at a company that it shall not be named, brought in to help get the company from their early first version of a product that was starting to get some traction to develop something more scalable, stabilize the thing. So there's a bunch of fires. Now, it turned out that the CEO, who was, I would say, not a developer, but a sort of tech enthusiast, I would say, thought he knew a lot more than he did, would go, for some reason, he had access to the production database and would just delete things, would just delete tables he thought were not necessary from the first version product that they had. And of course, then production would start breaking and we'd have to restore the databases into previous snapshots. And ultimately, he did that with both data and code because they were trying to, they were moving from a PHP app to, something else. And they had two systems up and running at the same time and thought refactoring meant just delete a bunch of stuff that you didn't think was really being used. Turns out a lot of it was being used in production, so we'd have to restore, and try to develop. So ultimately, the solution was to turn off all access to data and source code, and then that made life a lot easier. Shocking, right? I mean, there's a pause for silence. Like it's you'd think that wouldn't happen. It's just that is a true story.
I'm curious, like, what did they think? Do you have an idea of like what they were? Did they think that they were being helpful or trying to save time? Or
I'm sure. Oh, sure. Good intentions. Absolutely, good intentions. I mean, this is the CEO. They want to move faster. They had a first version of product with a lot of hands on it, a lot of different teams. They kind of moved from different developers, and it was pretty a hairy mess. And the person was trying to be helpful, I'm sure, but caused a lot of problems.
I've not had that many employers over the years, but I'm just thinking I could see there being a couple scenarios where someone might have been like, you know what, the estimates I'm getting from the team is going to take too long to get this. They're saying it's take too long so we can deprecate this. I'm just going to go ahead and delete that shit. Oops. Guess what I did?
And this was a small team, to be fair, so probably 5 developers, small startup getting things going. So
working in the same room?
No.
At that point, or were we all distributed at the point? Okay.
Distributed.
Yeah, I have some memories of working in very open offices and people just yelling, like, "What happened? Sorry." I'm curious, like, how did that experience shape your views on, like, say, team roles and access management?
You have different requirements for different team sizes and company sizes. If you're a start, I love the 0 to 1 phase. Okay, I love coming in. I love having the idea, and being able to start it, or coming in very early and helping to scale and helping to make architecture decisions, best practices, bring kind of my experience to a company or to a project. You do have to. I mean, what the hard lesson there and elsewhere was you have to lock things down from the very beginning. You have to design in your platform and your software architecture so that there aren't any holes. No SSH into the virtual machine in production just to do the one or two things. Like, put it in the software. Have an API for that. Start off by like having this philosophy of production is not accessible by anything other than the application through an API over HTTPS. Unless there's some weirdness about your application that requires something else. Like, there are exceptions. But for most things I've seen, web applications, mobile applications with a backend, nobody should ever should have a need to go in directly and muck around. Having that as a day one part of your development philosophy makes things a lot easier over time. It really does. It feels a little tough in the beginning because, I just can't go and manually change stuff, but you'll have the tools in place. You won't have that rising technical debt because you skipped those API calls. I'll get to that later. You never get to it. You end up doing manual things and tweaks and stuff and keeping that SSH port open to do these workarounds. And then that opens you up to security risks, CEOs trying to be helpful and not being helpful. So as a developer, I really encourage people to start as much as they can with a good philosophy about system architecture and say, let's lock this down. Let's keep things simple. Let's make it secure from day one, no access by default, and have this clean relationship between an application, API, and backend platform.
Hey listeners, it's Robbie here. It wasn't all that long ago. I'd find myself debugging a weird issue in one of our clients' Rails app. I log into one platform to track down the error, only to realize it was tied to some performance issue. And guess what? That meant hopping over into a completely different tool and trying to match things up based off of timestamps, if I was lucky. And let me tell you, my productivity didn't exactly thank me for that. Enter AppSignal, our podcast sponsor, and the tool that eliminates all that back and forth. They bring error tracking, performance monitoring, host metrics, custom metrics, uptime monitoring, and logging into one seamless platform. It's a single source of truth that helps keep your app running like a well-rehearsed symphony. Whether you're working with Ruby, Elixir, Node, Python, or tracking front-end errors in JavaScript, AppSignal has your back. They're always adding support for more languages and frameworks too. And here's the best part. AppSignal won't break the bank. Plans start at just $23 US a month. Plus, they're ISO 27001 certified and fully GDPR and HIPAA compliant, so your data is safe. Oh, and because you're a loyal Maintainable listener, you can use the promo code MAINTAINABLE at checkout for 10% off your first year. So head over to appsignal.com, tell them that your good friend Robbie from Maintainable sent you, and start making your app soon. That's interesting. I think just having been also around in the industry for about as long as you, and remember the days of SSHing, and I still work in an environment where we still do stuff in the console sometimes, but we've been more thinking about like how much time do we have to build out some comprehensive API for our application or our architecture so that we can interact and try to debug things when there's weird things we're just like, we don't really understand what's going on, and how can we diagnose this thing that's happening in production, but we can't replicate it locally or in staging unless we get like a data snapshot over to staging or whatever, just so we can play around. It's like, what's specifically going on with this particular data point? We might need to make a manual change to fix something just so we can at least alleviate it in the meantime. But I get that whole concern, like, well, is it a code issue? Is it we have to go update lots of records that have similar things? Or is it just, hey, we've got 20 users and one of them's having a problem today. When does that make sense? I guess it may depend on the sense of scale and the type of platform that you're building. Because like if it's like an internal application that has 20 employees, like maybe your security risks are a little bit different than having that be public user data or customer data or something like that. So, but thinking about like, there was a point when we got very conscious about being like, if our client was asking, I work in a consulting space, but if a client's asking for direct access to the database so that they can run their own reports, I'm air quoting, run their own reports. I'm like, I get that, but we're only going to give you a read-only version of that data, versus like something where you can update it, or if you're someone that's a little clever and thinks that they're going to be super helpful and just go run some SQL queries, let's try to avoid that and at least keep it through the Rails app. Or I'm working primarily like Ruby on Rails or something, and so running that through like a console, because at least we're interacting with the API of our application. But that might be over an SSH connection sometimes still. But we're also adding in new functionality where we can audit when and who did that, and what changed, so we have a paper trail, because we haven't had that for a long time in our industry. All that to say is like, that's interesting. I think there's maybe thinking about where your API endpoint is, and I'm not saying I disagree with the SSH thing. I just think there might be some wiggle room in there, I think, a little bit.
Sure. So you're talking about a couple things. One is really there are obvious exceptions. So if you have a customer, it's a single tenant system, and they want to access the database, run their own queries, and you lock it down by having a read-only. That SQL interface is essentially protocol and an API, right? It's broad. It might not make sense to abstract that with a RESTful API or something. It just might not be worth the effort. So that there's still ways to secure that. And like you're talking about, when you mentioned the sort of debugging aspect, people need to do that because there isn't great tooling for debugging distributed systems. And that's actually one of the problems we're solving at Multiplayer, to do distributed system debugging in production in a way that you can't before. So I've had a lot of pain in my career and founded Multiplayer, co-founded it with my partner to solve some of the problems as a developer that I had over and over and over. The lack of documentation, and the only way you get documentation at system level is manually doing it. Manually updating a Visio architecture diagram or API docs or whatever always gets out of date. It's terrible. Nobody can trust the source of truth. So one of the things we've done is we've solved the auto documentation problem. We use your system as the source of truth. OpenTelemetry has great data. We can analyze that data for discover components, dependencies, APIs, flows, discover it and track it so you don't have to do any manual work. And we also have this thing called the platform debugger, which allows you to essentially click a button. It's API based too. So if you're like, hey, I found a bug, click a button, it starts recording everything from front end deep into the back end. So not just your public API calls to your platform, but all the logs, metrics, traces that have to do with your session, and puts it together in one place. So you don't have to dig into the APM tool to find out like, oh, what were the traces that had to do with the thing, that bug, and is it this trace and that trace? So we correlate those things in a debug session. And we have some other things in development that will allow you to use your IDE, plug into a shared environment, have your requests and your session routed to your IDE only. And that's built on OpenTelemetry as well, because we'll know that, hey, I'm trying to debug my session right now, and I'm trying to debug this service. So route my requests just to my laptop so I can set a breakpoint, step through code while the rest of the system is running. So better tooling will help with this problem, where you won't have to SSH in to try to watch your production, environment or dig into something that's happening locally. You should be able to, it's just lack of tools. I think that requires that essentially that hole in the platform that allows you to go in and maybe do some damage accidentally or with good intentions. So
that's interesting. I haven't had a chance to really do a deep dive into what Multiplayer consists of there. So it sounds like a lot of useful tooling there. What sort of tech stacks does it currently support, or is it tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so Multiplayer as a company develops tools for teams that work on distributed systems. And the two big problems we're looking to solve is this auto documentation problem. So take the manual work out of like keeping your diagrams up to date and APIs and all that sort of stuff. And then this platform debugger, which is a missing tool, I think, for if you think about how developers work in distributed systems, it's always a hack. You're not connecting to a shared environment. You're just sort of like running a couple of containers and then maybe the cloud services, but it's not a one-to-one mapping with your environments. And that needs to be fixed, because it should be easy. From well-maintained software, you should be able to debug it. You should be able to run it. You should be able to have a shared environment, just like your production environment. So you've got an apples to apples comparison if you're making changes to code. And you should be able to use your IDE, and set breakpoints. And anyway, so we're solving those problems. We're built on OpenTelemetry. It supports a wide variety of different languages. All the popular ones, super easy to integrate with your code. And as in terms of like what we're calling the platform debugger gateway, which will let you kind of connect to a shared environment and use your IDE. It's any IDE. It's whatever you like to use. If you like JetBrains, if you like Visual Studio Code, whatever debugger you want to use, we're essentially providing this debugger gateway connection. It's essentially a proxy with a VPN into your platform. It's locked down to allow you to only do the things you're supposed to be able to, like, if you're a developer, you're only allowed to debug a particular service or set of services or do certain API calls. You can make it really constrained. Yeah, so that's a little bit about the company. We're really excited about this stuff. As a developer, it's so tough to develop distributed software. First is know what you have. What is your software? What are all the dependencies? If I change this, what will break? Will anything break? Do I need to tell somebody with that is responsible for a service upstream that, hey, I'm going to make this change? Is a breaking change? You have to do some work too. And then if moving quickly, if somebody reports a bug, right now it's a lot of manual sifting through APM data. It's not built for it. It's great for DevOps, I guess, for general system health. But I don't know about you, but as a developer, I never go into the Datadog, New Relic, or other tools to debug a problem, because it's so hard to find the related traces and logs, unless it's a big, it's a single exception. That's the easy case. But with distributed systems, sometimes I got this data over here from this call, I did this other thing, and that's the third thing with that data from 2 calls ago that is really the bug I need to fix. So you need that cross-trace correlated session information, and it should be automated. Like this, we're great as software developers, automating everybody else's industry and making it easy for them. I'm just so shocked that these tools don't exist already.
I'm trying to wrap my head around this a little bit. If I were to take, say, a web application that's got maybe there's a couple microservices involved as well. So maybe we've got 4 to 5 repositories, and we're deploying those to, say, AWS or what have you. What's the setup process look like for something like this? Is it as easy as just installing a library and adding an API key, and then it starts magically doing things and collecting data and then building these?
That's it. Yeah. So it's essentially, if you have a distributed system, you might use OpenTelemetry for your logs, metrics, traces. You might use a Datadog or New Relic or Signaz or Honeycomb, a bunch of others to just collect that. It's like a big bucket for these things. And to instrument your code, there's a lot of, depending on the language, a lot of them support auto instrumentation. So it's essentially a few lines of code and import a function call at the top of your, when you initialize your service, a little configuration, a token, auth key, that kind of thing, and maybe some choices about how much you want to sample. Are you sending all your telemetry 100%? Or you're going to not want to have that big bill, so maybe send 50%, whatever it is. So, we're built on OpenTelemetry. There's, a couple, there's essentially a library for us as well, a little configuration you put right next to the OpenTelemetry. And what we do is we give you a way to configure how much of that data you want to sort of use for auto documentation. So you could sample 1%. Or 2%, very small amount. That gets sent to us. And for the debugger, whenever you're marking a session as being debugged, then all of those traces and the logs related to them are sent for just your session. So it's a very small amount of data, essentially, and you get so much value out of it, so removing the need to keep diagrams up to date or API documentation, and have your system be the source of truth. So what we find is our customers are like, oh, finally, something we can count on, that I can treat as truth. The diagram that I had made an update to 6 months ago, and I know is not really up to date, I can just throw that away and now focus on developing. And yeah, it's really easy.
We'll be back with our interview with Tom in just a moment. Hey folks, it's me, Robbie. I want to take a quick moment to thank you for making time to listen to the podcast. If you're finding these conversations valuable, you know what to do. You know the drill. You know what I'm about to ask you to do. So fill in the blank. Blank, blank, blank. Do the thing. Yada, yada, yada. Help us do the thing. Invite more people to listen to the podcast. We'd love to have more people be part of our little community. Also, do you know someone you think I should have on the podcast? Shoot me an email to robbie@maintainable.fm and tell me more. I'm curious. All right, let's get back to our interview with Tom Johnson. I'm curious about just thinking about that workflow. You brought up just like even maybe updating a diagram. Do you think if we become reliant on, I'm not saying this is a counter to this kind of like approach, but maybe one of the challenges that humans, we have this struggle to take care and maintain these things. And it feels like tedious work, not the things we want to do. But if we say, well, we're just going to give it over to the software to let it automatically rebuild the API docs and everything. Do you feel like we're skipping that step of being better about communicating when we make changes to our APIs with the other people that might be reliant on that? And then if it becomes kind of like this passive, oh, wait, we changed when did we do that? And, it's like, so does the tooling help highlight that, or to the rest of the team or the other people that are using, like, hey, we made changes and that pushed out, but like what other steps did we kind of overlook in the process? And maybe it's not going to solve all those problems, but...
No, that's a great question. You're speaking to my heart here, because one of the other features we have in multiplayer is design branches. So all of this stuff that we discover is ultimately in these documents that are kept in sync from what we discover. But you can edit them, and you can create a design branch. Say, I always do a demo where I create an AI assist feature, okay, because everybody's adding AI. So I can create in multiplayer, create an AI assist feature branch, and then edit anything that's in there. System architecture, APIs, dependencies. And I'm not making those changes to my system. I'm saying, here's my design intent. For this feature, I want to add this microservice, the AI assist microservice, maybe OpenAI dependency, Pinecone, something like that. And then we support design reviews. So think of that as like the equivalent of a pull request, but on the front end. So you can go have your design, send it out for review and acceptance. People can review it. And you might want to socialize this with your peers, your CTO or your team lead who's trying to keep the architecture from getting out of hand. Maybe DevOps, because they're going to be needing to maybe make some changes to support the external dependencies, maybe change some Terraform, that kind of stuff. Or QA or front end, team, that what they're going to need to consume for their piece of the development. Everybody can then be on the same page before any development starts. And you can get this design branch, design approval, and then move to development. And that captures what you're saying. So multiplayer, the name multiplayer, we chose that for a reason, because developing software, I feel, is a team sport. You got to work together, and we've had terrible tooling to work together as teams. And one of the things we've looked to solve here is putting all the system architecture stuff together, allowing it to be editable, communicate these changes without having to have meetings. Like, you can actually show diffs and changes for the stuff in your design branch. So it's easy for anybody to go in at any time and say, oh, I see the full architecture, but let me see changes. Oh, it's these 3 things that are being changed. It's not much. And then go on and develop together. And that stops the technical debt from even getting started. Like, everybody can have the opportunity to weigh in on design more easily. Then you go to development, and when you're at the PR stage, you're like, oh, does this match? And then you can, when you've got the system auto documentation, okay, now it's deployed. Did it match? Did you go off the rails? And then you've got this verification that what you intended was really what ended up being in production. Or if it's not, it's not, and maybe you had a choice because you're developing. You had to make a choice. At least you have that logged somewhere. You have that. It's like, okay, this might be technical debt we have to deal with a little later, but you have that information in the team. A lot of this is about communication, working together, communicating design intent, status of things, that kind of stuff. And that's a big part of our tool.
When I think about, you brought up this might help teams avoid even incurring technical debt. What about for teams that are already dealing with, or at least the perception is that they're dealing with a lot of architectural technical debt and stuff that's been around for a while, legacy code. How do you approach managing architectural technical debt effectively?
That's a great question. And I don't want to make this conversation so sales pitchy, but I'll just mention one other thing. So we have a lot of customers who are consulting organizations that help, enterprises that have some legacy distributed systems, no documentation. And what we can do is part of that auto documentation is discovery. What are all the components? What are all the APIs? There's no documentation about this. You can deal with that existing technical debt. First, you have to know what's there. And you can't do it easily by just reading the code. One customer used our product on a system that is like 2 million lines of code. Okay, you're never going to read all that code, figure out what's wired to what. And this is Java RMI calls. This isn't like modern RESTful calls. But they're able to say, okay, let's have it running. Let's have the system watch it. And then pop, components pop up, APIs pop up, dependencies pop up, and suddenly that picture, that top-down system architecture understanding is there. And then that's a big step to kind of putting a plan together to handle technical debt for a legacy system. You have to first understand what you have, then put a plan together to modernize the system, which is a very common thing that has to be done. So yeah, whether you're diving in, I guess regardless of the product we offer, if you're going into a system that is legacy, your first task is really understand it first before you start changing things. And that understanding has to be top down, system architecture, components, what calls what depends on what. And then you can come up with a plan to change it. And, it makes a lot of sense if you're on a new project to really try to keep ahead of the technical debt. Don't let it stack up. And big part of that is having this accurate source of truth documentation, great tools for debugging and development, and team communication, I think.
Once you got that, say, top-down perspective or view of your system, and you've identified a number of things, and we speak to a lot of people, teams that will have huge laundry lists of things that they're just someday maybe we'll get to these things, but they struggle to figure out how to best prioritize that. Have you found any effective ways to navigate that, at least in terms of here's how to identify what seems most important or most useful to start with? Or if there's teams that are just we're just putting out fires all the time and we're keeping things running and it's relatively stable enough that we can sleep at night and not worry about it on the weekends, but we know there's this huge list of things we need to get to at some point. How do you kind of start to approach that?
It's hard to have rules that you can apply to every situation because I think it depends so much on the project. But in general, you tend to ask the same kind of questions because a lot of the priorities are the same. First, it's the customer. It's the customer affected by this technical debt in some way. For example, is the reporting feature really slow for large customers because the queries weren't optimized for large amounts of data? It might be working for small, but large, and is it service affecting? Is it customer affecting this technical debt? I think that kind of stuff ends up getting prioritized because managers can understand it easily. Customers probably complaining about it, and it makes sense to tackle that. Then you have, I think, other technical debt that affects, developers and speed to development, that if you've got a good technical leader and, depending on your organization, that can get prioritized as well. And most of the places I've gone, it's usually the customer affecting stuff is first, and then secondarily is the, the quality of life. And in between is new features. Okay. So having the time to tackle the debt, you usually have to juggle, I find. But I think that if you're at a good organization, they're going to value developer quality of life, but also connect it to, it's not just about making developers happy, but they're going to work faster. That feature that you want will get out faster if there is just cleanup that happens from time to time or on an ongoing basis. I like to allocate, personally with the teams that I lead and work on, I like to allocate a certain amount of every week that's just put the new features, pencil down, tackle anything that's been on the to-do list. Sometimes there's nothing to do if you're keeping ahead of things, but there's usually something. You put a feature out quickly and you're I'm going to come back to this and optimize this a little bit or document this a little bit better. So I encourage people to keep that list or even centralize the list. I have my list, and then we tackle stuff on a regular basis. So the list doesn't get just so big, it seems like an impossible task. I encourage team leaders and teams to have an ongoing, certain allocated amount of time fixed, precious, for that the developer even have the freedom to do themselves, like to choose, okay, this is my top list. This is what I feel is more important, because then you'll probably end up getting the biggest things done first, the most important things done first, because I think developers will always prioritize that stuff well. Anyway, that's my general advice. Yeah.
I think that is some good advice, and something I think about, people listening out there. Sometimes I hear people talking about, and we have, clients that come to us and they're like, hey, we feel like we've been making some progress on improving and paying down some of our technical debt. But the vibe of the team is that we're not making progress, even though they can show look, we've closed all these items in the list, but the team still feels like, we're just waiting and bogging through and we're never going to catch up. And we just need to rewrite this whole thing one day. And that's it's going to be greener on the other side one day. Any advice on how to help people kind of get out of that, or at least maybe thinking about if they're someone that's trying to communicate, no, we're making progress. It's much better than it was 2 years ago, but you've only been here a year, so you haven't seen how far we've come so far that, in this period of time.
I think it comes down to leadership and your core values for team and the environment and the culture, essentially the culture. You can't just say, hey, it's not really that bad. If people are saying it's bad, right? It's got to be better. It is bad. They're telling you it's bad. How do you make it better? And I think that if you're in a situation like that as a team leader, if you want to just have depressed developers all the time that will leave for another job that's more fulfilling, stay that way, okay? But, you're going to probably lose a lot of your intellectual property. The stuff in their heads just walks out. You've got to get developers up to speed. It's really painful. So it's better to just really have assess your culture, your values, and change things. Actually change things. And then, it's hard to throw out a whole, if somebody's saying throw out all the code and let's rewrite it from scratch. You're not going to be, in most cases, you're not going to be able to do that. And frankly, there's no guarantee that it would be better even if they threw it out. As a young developer, I had that desire so many times. As I got a little older and more mature, I said, okay, well, there's some things I can do, some things that would make sense just to build on top of. But I think you can still have a positive culture and have maybe some legacy software that you have to live with, and pay down the technical debt and do some other things so that people have this, they understand their task, the role in the project, they can feel progress, and those are things that will lead to a better quality of life for everybody involved and probably better outcomes for a business, I think.
Hey folks, it's Robbie here. I want to take a quick moment to tell you about my company, Planet Argon. Imagine us as your trusted florist shop for software projects, where legacy applications blossom into something fresh and vibrant. Whether your project needs a little extra support with staff augmentation, like adding a few bright lilies, or the delicate care of fractional development services, like arranging the perfect bouquet, we're here to help your software garden thrive. We specialize in a variety of technologies, including Ruby on Rails, React, and Laravel, just to name a few. So if you know of a company with software that's feeling more like a wilted rose, struggling with technical debt, or in need of new features, send them our way. We'll bring their projects to life, or back to life, with all the elegance of orchids, the cheerfulness of daisies, and maybe even a touch of wildflowers to keep things exciting. Visit us at planetargon.com. Again, that's planetargon.com. All right, let's get back to the show. And remember, the right touch can make any project bloom. I think that's some really good sage advice for people to think about. And I'm going to ruminate on that myself as well. And thinking about how I'm actually working on it with a consulting client right now, and they're dealing with this, and it hadn't really occurred to me that I'm trying to help them get better at communicating where they're making progress, but also just realizing you have to kind of also acknowledge that there's still pain there, and that's okay, but you're also trying to navigate that carefully so that you don't want to necessarily encourage an environment where people are just complaining about things necessarily all the time, and getting to the point where a rewrite's going to be the only way out of the situation, and then, or let them go get that other job somewhere else and let them find out too, because that is part of the career journey and everything. We're not trying to keep everybody hostage in our code bases, obviously. So, and it might be better somewhere else, and that can be great. With that, I have a couple of quick questions for you I want to ask before we wrap up. I want to talk about one of your strong opinions. Tell me more on, I haven't asked this question in a long time, but tabs versus spaces.
Oh my goodness, tabs. Of course, tabs. Because one delete, and also I don't need a special IDE to interpret my spaces. And I've been bitten by somebody likes 3, somebody likes 5. I open it in, this is
The answer's 2.
Yes, there are 2. Exactly. It's like then so it's not tabs versus spaces. It's tabs versus how many spaces versus tabs versus 1, 2 spaces, 3 spaces, 5 spaces, n spaces. And I say tabs for indentation, spaces for alignment. I don't align parameters and stuff like that. I know some people like to create art with their code. I gave up that a long time ago, so I do have a strong opinion about that. But I'm happy to develop in languages where I'm forced to use spaces as well. That's okay. Right. It's okay.
Is there a non-software, non-technical book that you find yourself recommending to peers?
Yes, it's called Making Comics by Scott McCloud, I believe. First of all, you don't have to desire to create graphic novels or comics if you don't draw. It's a great read. First of all, it's entertaining. It's entertaining to learn about how comics are made and how to think about telling stories. But it's really most interesting for that. How do you tell stories? How do you communicate? And you can take some of the lessons that are in this book with you in your career journey, because communication is such a big part of what we do, software development. It's not just code. It's let's talk, let's work. We've got this problem we need to solve. How should we do it? Here's my idea. Socialize it, be able to accept other people's ideas and be able to go back and forth in a nice way without being too defensive but also making a case for your stuff and communicating in general. And that, not just about these things, but so much of what we have to do requires communication. And everybody, I think, could brush up their skills, get tips. And this is such a fun book on comics that is applicable in so many other ways.
Nice. I just pulled that up real quick and I was like, I think I bought this book for my nephew maybe 6 or 7 years ago. And I'm like, it didn't even occur to me to get myself a copy. So I'm going to pick that up. I like that. That's a great recommendation. I'm going to include links for that for everybody in the show notes as well. And with that, where can listeners best follow your thoughts and ruminations about software engineering and observability and tabs online?
So I'm Tom Johnson 3 on all the socials, and we also have Try Multiplayer to follow Multiplayer. And I'm Thomas Johnson on LinkedIn, and of course you can go to multiplayer.app to learn about multiplayer and the auto documentation and debugging and a lot of the other things we're going to do. We're also building a platform designer, so you can compose platforms from visually and click to deploy. We've got some really cool stuff in the works, kind of like Figma for the back end, really. And we're on this at the early phases of this journey, and we've got a lot to share and a lot of fun stuff happening.
Yeah, I'll include links for those on there as well. I'm curious, were you just the third Tom Johnson to sign up on these social sites, or are you the third?
So I am the third, Thomas Francis Johnson the third. Oh,
so am I.
Awesome.
I'm a third as well. I'm Robert James Russell the third. So there you go.
I used to, my early email addresses just had Tom J or Tom Johnson, but when I signed up for Gmail all those years ago, somebody beat me to it. So I had to use the 3. But then it sort of stuck as the unique one I could always get on any new service. So. And
I also saw that on Multiplayer, you can book a demo. So if you're curious,
yes,
go click that link and you can schedule a demo, I think. Well, with that, it's been such a delight having you join us on Maintainable, Tom. Thank you so much for stopping by to talk shop with us.
Thanks for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Maintain a people.